Hello everybody and welcome to Grey History, episode 81, The Trial of Queen Marie Antoinette. In the last episode, we saw the beginning of the terror. From the arrest of all suspects to the fixing of prices and wages, draconian legislation was now the law of the land. Having promised the blood of the Brissotts and the Marie Antoinettes, it was time for the deputies to deliver. Justice was at hand. Yet, before we begin the show trials of the French Revolution, a humongous thank you to those people keeping Grey History on the air. We have tons to explore in 2025, and it's only possible thanks to the generosity of the membership community. With bonus episodes, ad-free listening, and a range of other perks, enjoy all the benefits of doing your bit to keep Grey History going. I could really use your help, and with a 7-day free trial and new annual memberships, it's never been easier to join the party. So please help me bring you more of the show you've come to love and support the show today. There's links in the show notes and on the website, or just Google Grey History Patreon. Also, as we wrap up the festive time of year, please do share the show with anyone who you think would be interested in a new history podcast in 2025. If you hear the words history, podcast, or sans-culotte, that's your chance to spread the revolutionary message. Of course, it's with a festive cheer that I get to introduce the newest members of the Grey History community. A warm welcome to the newest virtuous citizens, Emmanuel and Armin. Another warm welcome to the newest true revolutionaries, Andre, Seeker, Fred, Mike, and Kevin. All revolutions need their champions, and so it's a great pleasure to thank the champions of the people, Cindy, George, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Joel, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Jeff, Ritas, Cameron, Britt, Dan, Paul, Deborah, Susan, and Danny. Lastly, there's the great of the greats, the pantheon of the nation, the heroes of the Republic. A special thank you to Brian, Charles, Jeff, Olga, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, Kevin S., and Fernando. Anyway, that's enough from me, so let's get into it. The Avenger, the Shortener, the National Razor, the Guillotine. There is perhaps no greater symbol of the revolutionary era than the scaffold and the blade. Idolized and feared, praised and assailed, the machine encapsulates both the hopes and horrors of the French Revolution. Indeed, long before the innovation came to represent the excesses of the terror, it symbolized something else entirely: equality. Like every aspect of the old regime, justice was unequal. Heretics were burnt, traitors were quartered, highwaymen were broken on the wheel. Yet the true differentiation in capital punishment was not the variation of methods, but rather for estates. For most of the kingdom's executions, commoners were simply hanged. Not so for the nobility. Decapitated with dignity, aristocrats escaped the noose. In an era increasingly questioning the inequalities of life, those of death were no less glaring. By 1789, as every aspect of the kingdom was torn down and replaced, the nation's justice system followed suit. Courts, judges, prisons, and laws were all overturned, and the matter of capital punishment was no different. With Enlightenment spirit guiding every action, rationality and humanity soon found their voice. Aggrieved by both the inequality and brutality of old regime executions, in October 1789, one deputy came forth to propose a novel solution. A doctor by profession, Joseph Ignace Guillotin had an idea. To reflect the equality of the new era, Guillotin proposed that all capital punishments should be performed uniformly. Henceforth, a torture-free decapitation should be the universal demise of anyone condemned to death. This proposal was praised, but it was also ignored. For a time, the National Assembly decreed only the first article of Guillotin's proposals, that offences of the same kind be punished by the same penalty. Yet this was merely part of Guillotin's proposition. Disgusted by torture and wary of botched executions, Guillotin had proposed not only decapitation, but decapitation by machine. Again, Guillotin was ignored. Almost 2 years later, the National Assembly finalised its new penal code in September 1791. Despite a fiery debate in which Robespierre opposed the death penalty, capital punishment remained in place. Critically, hangings were now a thing of the past. Rather than have aristocrats hanged, commoners would die like nobility. Henceforth, beheading was the only means of execution. But while the death penalty remained, the method was not yet a machine. Instead, the Assembly had failed to specify the exact means of execution, leaving the implication that the task could be done with a traditional sword. The following year, this proved problematic. In January 1792, a murderer was condemned to death in Paris. With the new penal code now in effect, the ambiguity of methodology had to be resolved. According to the law, the punishment was pure and simple death. Torture, which had outraged philosophers in the preceding decades, had been explicitly banned. Yet, in the gruesome practicalities of beheadings, we quickly arrive at the issue. Executions were seldom clear-cut. An inexperienced executioner could miss his mark, and even veterans could have bad days on the scaffold. Furthermore, the act was tricky enough when the victim was still and compliant. But what if they weren't? In the past, the low number of executed aristocrats minimized these difficulties. However, with beheadings now the norm, the Minister of Justice wrote to the Legislative Assembly asking for further clarification. Joined by the city's executioner, the minister itemised the multiple issues with beheadings by a sword. After one execution, the sword will no longer be in a condition to perform another. Being liable to get notched, it is absolutely necessary, if there are many persons to execute at the same time, that it should be ground and sharpened anew. It would be necessary then to have a sufficient number of swords already. That would lead to great and almost insurmountable difficulties. Additionally, it is to be considered that, when there shall be several criminals to execute at the same time, the terror that such an execution presents, by the immensity of blood which it produces and which is scattered all about, will carry fright and weakness into the most intrepid hearts of those whose turn is to come. Such weaknesses would present an invincible obstacle to the execution. The patient will no longer be able to support himself. The execution, if persisted in, will become a struggle and a massacre. Continuing to list no shortage of issues, the Minister of Justice sought clarification from the deputies. How were authorities to proceed? Commissioning a report of their own, the findings of the Legislative Assembly were frightening. Even in countries with regular executions, imperfect results were far too common. Having reformed the law to prevent torture and provide a painless death, it was clear that traditional methods risked cruelty to criminals and spectators alike. Thus, on the 20th of March, 1792, the Legislative Assembly decreed in favour of a machine. A month later, the first criminals were put to death. But, despite Guillotin's name eventually inspiring that of the machines, the guillotine, as it's known in English, was not Guillotin's invention. In fact, similar devices were already present in Europe. Although uncommon, machines like the guillotine had existed for hundreds of years, notably in England, Ireland and Scotland. Within France, the newest design was not Guillotin's either. As such, other names like the Louisette were used at a time, reflecting the role of the surgeon Antoine Louis in designing the machine's prototype. It wasn't for several months that the guillotine became the accepted name. Now, if you've never actually seen a guillotine, the device itself is relatively straightforward. A tall, upright frame suspends an angled blade. Below, a smaller frame is used to hold the condemned's neck directly underneath the blade. In order to ensure the victim was subdued, the condemned was bound and then placed against a plank which tilted downwards, lowering the victim into position. The blade would then be released, splitting the spinal cord with ease. Well, usually with ease. Like all innovations, this minimum viable product still needed some UX improvements. In July 1792, an imperfect execution caused public alarm when the swelling of the frame's wooden grooves prevented the blade from properly falling. Henceforth, the grooves were made of metal. However, as the guillotine was perfected during the summer of 1792, the monarchy was overthrown. As such, the Legislative Assembly soon decreed another innovation of justice, the Revolutionary Tribunal. It's here that we can begin to incorporate the themes of the last several episodes since the fall of the Girondins in mid-1793. As the summer progressed, and as ultra-radicalism rose, both the enraged and the Hébertists demanded uncompromising justice. Not only should all suspects be detained, but the machine should swiftly eliminate all of the people's enemies. Hoarders, speculators, military elites, federalists, emigres, renegade priests, from Vendean peasants to heartless profiteers, the list of the condemned was both long and varied. With traitors operating in every corner of the country, cries for swift and severe justice were increasingly the norm. Hébert called for a guillotine to accompany every column of the Revolutionary Army, while radical deputies sought an overhaul of the lethargic Revolutionary Tribunal. Indeed, despite requests for uncompromising justice, the blade was in insufficient use. Although the Revolutionary Tribunal had been reinstated in March 1793, executions had hardly been forthcoming. In Paris, between March and September, just 66 of 260 suspects had been found guilty of a capital offence. For revolutionaries demanding the immediate punishment of thousands of traitors, this was simply unacceptable. Thus, throughout the summer, calls had been rising to increase the speed and severity of the Revolutionary Tribunal. If the convention failed to act, the people would do so themselves. The situation changed dramatically after September 5. Although not official government policy, terror was now the order of the day. Consequently, reforms triggered by both Toulon's treason and the risings of 4 and 5 September overhauled the workings of the Revolutionary Tribunal. Henceforth, the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris was split into 4 sections, essentially quadrupling the number of judges, jurors, prosecutors, clerks, and other judicial staff. The convention was attempting to speed up the process of revolutionary justice. Thus, along with other policies such as the law of suspects and the law of the general maximum, September 1793 saw the introduction of reforms to dramatically overhaul the arrest and trial of suspects. These reforms proved effective. Having executed just 66 of 260 suspects between March and September, the Parisian tribunal condemned almost 3 times that number in the final 3 months of the year. Along with the rapidly expanding number of prisoners, which likewise had almost tripled in the capital, the convention's repression was rapidly gaining pace. But as traitors were sent to the guillotine with an ever-increasing speed, the execution of the condemned is not without irony. While the machine was designed to eliminate distinctions, its most famous victim could not be more distinct. Since her husband's execution in January that year, Marie Antoinette had remained in the Temple, a prison in central Paris which was once a fortified monastery for the Knights Templar. There, she lived with her children and her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth. Although provided basic necessities, the sufferings of the Queen were still considerable. In large part, this was due to the health of her son. Technically King Louis XVII, the young child had become increasingly sickly. His elder brother had died in June 1789 at the age of 7, and now it appeared the 8-year-old could follow suit. In May and June, doctors were called on multiple occasions to tend to the child's illnesses. This would be alarming for any mother, let alone one imprisoned by revolutionary authorities while grieving an executed husband. However, politics soon amplified the problem. At the start of July, it was decreed that Louis XVII would be separated from his mother. Shortly thereafter, a series of officials entered the family's quarters and forcibly removed the child. Marie Antoinette responded exactly how you would expect. Historian Hilaire Belloc remarks that upon this terrible night, for the only time in her life, the Queen completely lost all her self-command. Accordingly, all the intensity of her spirit came out nakedly in defence of her child. Of course, protests mattered little, and the Queen was permanently separated from her last remaining son. Henceforth, the boy was placed in the care of a reliable sans-culotte family, charged with providing a republican education. Unfortunately, this shoemaker was not that reliable, and Louis XVII would die of illness just 2 years later at the age of 10. With her husband dead and her son forcibly taken, the Queen was under little illusion as to how her story would likely end. The question was not if she would follow Louis to the scaffold, but when. The answer was October 1793. Having explicitly promised the blood of the Brissotts and the Marie Antoinettes, the convention turned its attention to political trials in the aftermath of 5 September. Until now, the body had been in no hurry for revolutionary justice. Distracted by foreign and civil war, the trials of the traitors were not a top priority. In fact, some historians believe that the trial of the Queen was not a priority at all, especially when peace-inclined Jacobins saw the prisoner as a potential bargaining chip. But with terror now the de facto order of the day, political and practical factors soon prioritised severe justice. Practically, the Queen's execution had tangible benefits, at least in the eyes of some revolutionaries. A rallying point for rebels and reactionaries, the liberation of Marie Antoinette was also a stated goal of the coalition powers. Depriving their enemies of this casus belli could deliver a staggering blow. Yet, the trial of the former queen was for the most part political. Although demanding the execution of military elites and the Girondin leadership, the Hébertists had never forgotten the Queen. As such, in their campaign for terror throughout the summer of 1793, Hébert regularly focused on Marie Antoinette. This was not without reason. A clever journalist and an ambitious politician, Hébert understood the public mood. More so than others, it was the fate of Marie Antoinette which captivated the nation's imagination. Why? Well, this was all her fault. Demonized for a decade, the Queen was held responsible for the entirety of the nation's ills. The bankruptcy, the war, the plots, the failings of the revolution, all were the workings of the Austrian monster, the Austrian she-wolf, the Austrian whore. Consequently, her continued existence was an affront. Battling to contain the passions of the ultra-radical movement, the embattled convention had no option but to commence her trial. Loathed with a passion unseen towards her husband, this hostility shaped every aspect of the case. Formally referred to the Revolutionary Tribunal on the 3rd of October, events proceeded with unprecedented haste. It took almost 6 weeks for Louis's indictment to result in his execution. For the Queen, it was merely a few days. Indeed, the trial of Marie Antoinette had significant differences to that of her late husband. Firstly, in the process, and secondly, in the most scandalous of charges. If we start with the former, you may recall that for Louis's trial, considerable time was spent on if and how the king should be tried. Eventually, the convention decided that the Constitution of 1791 did not grant Louis immunity, but a regular court was still unable to try the king. As such, the convention performed the task itself, with deputies acting as the prosecutors, judges, and jurors. This same approach was not repeated for Marie Antoinette. Instead, the Queen would simply be brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal, just like ordinary citizens. However, Marie Antoinette was not an ordinary citizen, and the decree requiring her trial reflected as such. On the 3rd of October, it was the radical Varenne who proposed the commencement of proceedings. Moments after another purge of Girondin deputies who remained in the convention, Varenne moved to prioritise the fate of the hated Queen. The convention has just given a great example to the traitors. It still has a solemn decree to make. The Capet woman has not been punished. It is time for the convention to bring the sword of the law down upon this guilty head. Already, malice, taking advantage of your silence, is spreading the rumour that Marie Antoinette, tried secretly by the Revolutionary Tribunal and found innocent, has been returned to the Temple, as if it were possible that a woman, covered in the blood of the French people, could be cleared by a popular tribunal, by a revolutionary tribunal. I ask that the convention expressly decree that the revolutionary tribunal will immediately deal with the trial and judgment of the Capet woman. Greeted by applause, the Queen had just 2 weeks to live. Less than a fortnight later, the Queen was interrogated by revolutionary authorities. After dark on the 12th of October, Marie Antoinette was taken from her small, damp cell in the conciergerie. This cell had been her home since August, and the barren room, with a pathetic attempt at a window, was utterly miserable. For those interested, you can actually visit this cell today, though the room has been heavily renovated since the 1790s. In fact, the restored monarchy turned it into a commemorative chapel, but the four walls still ooze a combination of gloom and despair. Back in 1793, the Conciergerie prison was part of the same complex as the Revolutionary Tribunal, so the Queen did not have to go far for her interrogation. Led by candlelight through a series of narrow passages, she was eventually taken to a large hall, sat on a bench, and subjected to a series of questions. This was not her official trial, but rather preliminary proceedings. Nonetheless, these proceedings were a far cry from 21st century standards. The Queen did not know who was before her, or even how many people stood in the poorly lit room. Nor, for that matter, did she have any legal representation and was left to defend herself. Answering a series of questions with short statements in her favour, she did her best to assert her innocence and that she had always wished the country well. Assigned lawyers for her trial, the Queen was returned to captivity. Her team would be given just 1 day to consult with the accused. 2 days later, on the 14th of October, the trial of Marie Antoinette commenced in central Paris. An event of enormous public interest, regular citizens crammed into every inch of the public galleries. Bustling with excitement, onlookers waited outside the chamber, hoping to see a mere glimpse of these historic events. Before the arrival of the nation's most famous prisoner, the members of the court took their seats. 5 judges presided over the trial, and below them 15 members of the jury. Representing a broad swathe of professions, the jurors were comprised of contractors, craftsmen, artisans, a barber, a hatter, and even a man who made violins. Alongside these dependable sans-culottes were a surgeon and an optician, so the jury was diverse, to say the least. Well, at least when it came to professions. One didn't need glasses to identify the obvious common trait. They were all staunch Jacobins. With the jury in place and the judges at the bench, the time had come for the arrival of Marie Antoinette. Since her husband's dethronement, Louis had often been referred to as Louis Capet. This was because the Bourbons were a branch of the Capetian dynasty, hence Louis Capet. Consequently, the widow Capet was the official title used for the former queen. After some brief formalities, the trial was underway. It's now that we must introduce a figure who is synonymous with the terror. Antoine Fouquier-Tinville. Aged 47 at the time of the Queen's trial, Fouquier-Tinville had worked in law prior to the Revolution's outbreak. A distant relative of Camille Desmoulins, this committed Jacobin used his connections and credentials to secure a role in the initial Revolutionary Tribunal established after the fall of the monarchy. The following year, when the Convention re-established the tribunal in March 1793, Fouquier-Tinville was elevated to the position of public prosecutor. Clever, cold, and undoubtedly hard-working, the new prosecutor threw himself at the task. In office for more than a year, his position made Fouquier-Tinville a central figure of the judicial terror. It is he who prosecuted many of the Revolution's heroes and villains. Charlotte Corday, Marie Antoinette, the Duc d'Orléans, Bailly, Barnève, the various factions of the Jacobins. Given this, and his role in the terror more broadly, it's not surprising his actions engender a great deal of controversy. In fact, like Robespierre, his name has come to be associated with the excesses of the period. Detractors would note his tendency to include all evidence against the accused, even when its credibility was lacking. Harsh and violent, historian Alphonse de Noyer remarks that Fouquier-Tinville adapted himself exactly to the designs and intentions of the legislators. Now, that last point is critical. De Noyer states that Fouquier-Tinville's activity, zeal and application was adapted to the wishes of the convention. This reflects many traditional accounts which sees Fouquier-Tinville as a tool of the convention, and specifically Robespierre. Portrayed as a powerful henchman, keen for the spillage of blood, his power, autonomy and importance varies between accounts. However, when Robespierre is seen as the terror's emperor, Fouquier-Tinville is often depicted as a sort of judicial Darth Vader. You know, dark, merciless figure whose name inspires fear, just armed with a different sort of blade. Obviously, I'm exaggerating a little, but such representations are still common amongst historians today. But other scholars fiercely disagree with the notion that Fouquier-Tinville and Robespierre were accomplices, allies, or some variation of close associates. Historian Albert Marty, for example, eviscerates any idea that Fouquier-Tinville worked at the behest of Robespierre. To make his case, Marty points to evidence that Robespierre was trying to have the Committee of Public Safety remove the prosecutor during the height of the terror. Rejecting the idea that he was an instrument of the incorruptible, Marty also suggests that Fouquier-Tinville's dismissal would have reduced the number of executions. Additionally, historian Antoine Boulogne recently described Fouquier-Tinville as a committed Jacobin, but aloof from the politics and personalities of the club. Consequently, this would challenge the idea that he was a staunch Robespierrist, eager to see the demise of both the Hébertists and the Dantonists. So what we have here is a complex and controversial figure, one who will continue to meet and explore throughout the political trials of the Terror. Either a monster or a misunderstood public servant, it all depends on who you ask. But, just to be clear, if you were to ask a royalist, or indeed many revolutionaries, the answer would certainly be monster. With Fouquier-Tinville's opening address, the Queen's crimes were finally revealed. The charges against the widow Capet was a list of every sin, real and imagined. A complete account of the crimes would be a considerable digression. Transcripts of the proceedings literally go for page after page. But as Fouquier-Tinville listed the heinous acts of the Austrian traitor, the prosecutor detailed every allegation you would expect. Of course, the Queen was responsible for the war and its setbacks, luring France into conflict before betraying the nation. Likewise, the bankruptcy was also her fault, the spendthrift indulging in unthinkable extravagance while secretly financing the Austrian monarchy. Finally, it was the Queen who had rejected every essence of the revolutionary project and manipulated her poor husband into doing her wicked bidding. In short, it was all her fault. Emphasis on the her. Embedded in these charges was no shortage of sexist tropes and stereotypes. Yet, uninhibited in his scope of denunciations, Fouquier-Tinville portrayed Marie Antoinette as the central figure in a slew of other crimes. In an era obsessed with conspiracy, the Queen was the spider who wove everything together. From the corruption of ministers to massacres and rebellions, every setback, every reversal, was the work of this devious woman. Depicted as the source of all evils, The message was clear. The Queen was a sinister parasite which had leached France of its strength, its wealth, and even its morality. Eventually, Fouquier-Tinville summarized his long and violent account with 3 distinct accusations. According to this report, the public prosecutor brings the above accusations against Marie Antoinette, qualifying herself in her interrogatory by the title of Lorraine and Austria, widow of Louis Capet, and states, first, that in conjunction with the brothers of Louis Capet and the infamous ex-minister Cologne, they squandered away, in a most horrid manner, the French finances, sent innumerable sums to the emperor, and drained the national treasury. Second, that as well by herself as by the aid of her counter-revolutionary agents, she kept up correspondence with the enemies of the Republic, and informed these enemies, or caused them to be informed, of all the plans of campaigns and attacks resolved on and determined on in the Council. Third, that through her intrigues and manoeuvres, and those of her agents, she formed conspiracies and plots against the interior and exterior safety of France, and to that effect kindled a civil war in several provinces of the Republic, armed one citizen against another, and by these means spilled the blood of an incalculable number of citizens. With charges against the Queen formally presented, the prosecution summoned witnesses to make their case. These witnesses were not who you might expect. An assortment of public and lesser-known figures, those presented were a motley crew. Starting with a Montagnard deputy who was once an officer in the Versailles National Guard, the court was told of the Queen's deeds during the first months of the Revolution. Notably, this included the infamous events of October 1789, which saw the trampling of the tricolour cockade by the Flanders Regiment. You may recall that it was this outrage which triggered the October Days, when tens of thousands of Parisians, notably market women, marched on Versailles and forcibly relocated the monarchs to Paris. Another witness, a former palace guard, told of rumours he had heard of plots to save the royal couple on the day of the flight to Varennes. The public prosecutor attempted to link Lafayette and the former Mayor Bailly to the schemes, but the Queen insisted that neither man was involved. Now, this linking may seem unusual, especially with Lafayette currently rotting in a Prussian dungeon. But Mayor Bailly would shortly be put on trial. In fact, Bailly was even brought as a witness and vigorously protested his involvement in any alleged conspiracy. Badgered with a list of his own alleged crimes, including his role in the Champ de Mars massacre in July 1791, the interrogation of this witness soon became a farce. Indeed, many of these alleged witnesses bordered on the farcical, with rumours and hearsay being a key form of evidence. Take, for example, the following evidence of a judge who had been called as a witness. With the Queen allegedly responsible for the trap set by the Swiss guards on the 10th of August, the unintended bloodshed which accompanied the overthrow of the monarchy was deemed to be the work of her counter-revolutionary plots. This very impartial witness stated the following. All the facts contained in the act of accusations are of such public notoriety that it is unnecessary to spend time on them. If my fullest conviction can be of any weight, I will not hesitate to affirm that I am fully persuaded that this woman is guilty of the greatest crimes, that she has always conspired against the liberty of the French. The following is a circumstance which I have to relate to you. On the 10th of August, I was present at the siege of the Tuileries. I saw under the bed of Marie Antoinette full or empty bottles, from which I concluded that she had herself distributed wine to the Swiss soldiers, that these wretches in their intoxication might assassinate the people. Having found empty bottles underneath her bed, the deposed monarch was evidently guilty of a plot to assassinate the people. As I said, some of these witnesses were farcical, and worryingly, this particular witness was even a judge. Going further, this same individual linked Brissot and Girondin deputies to these crimes on the 10th of August, ensuring that the Jacobin opponents were equally tarnished by the sins of royalty. But before we move on, I would like to make it clear to anyone that ever finds empty bottles underneath my bed that I am innocent of murdering the French people. Murdering the French cheese board, well, that's another matter entirely. However, when discussing the witnesses called by the prosecution, there is one name that cannot be ignored: Jacques-René Hébert. Having dominated pretty much every episode since the assassination of Marat, it's perhaps not surprising to hear Hébert's name. But while Hébert plays a critical and infamous role in these proceedings, the question can first be asked: why? A journalist and commune official, Hébert makes less sense as a witness compared to, say, a palace servant or the former mayor. Yet this trial was as much about discrediting monarchy as it was delivering justice, and it's here that Hébert played a major role. Of all the scandalous accusations levelled against the former queen, there is one that is simply disgusting: incest. In order to thoroughly tarnish both Marie Antoinette and the monarchy, Hébert had enacted his own sinister plot. After the young Louis XVII had been separated from his mother, Hébert had visited the boy in prison. There, municipal officials questioned the 8-year-old as to inappropriate relations with his mother and aunt. Unsurprisingly, the impressionable and traumatized child answered yes to all their questions, or at least so the officials claimed. What unscrupulous means were taken to secure these allegations, we simply don't know, but we do know how the public reacted to them. With Hébert accusing the Queen of sexually assaulting her young son, witnesses were disgusted, and not with Marie Antoinette. Hoping to prove the immorality of the accused, it was the accuser who now appeared detestable. Certainly, the courtroom stirred with disapproval, and some reports claim that Robespierre smashed a plate in anger when news reached him of Hébert's reckless stupidity. Whatever the case, judges and the prosecutor tried to brush past Hébert's testimony, but one juror insisted that the Queen break her silence and answer these abhorrent allegations. The damage was done. Winning sympathy from onlookers and posterity alike, Marie Antoinette responded with only a curt reply. If I did not respond, it was because it would be against nature for a mother to reply to such an accusation. On this, I appeal to all mothers who may be here. The appeal worked, and prints of this scene were soon circulating Europe, advancing the counter-revolutionary cause. Although the trial continued over the next 2 days, it is worth focusing on Hébert's testimony in particular. While the Queen was subjected to all sorts of allegations, accusations of incest were in a world of their own. Scandalising both historians and contemporaries, Hébert's actions provides considerable ammunition for those who detest this ultra-revolutionary. In fact, for a historian who in some ways was indirectly impacted by these events, we can turn to the work of historian Jean Jaurès. Now, Jaurès was not only a historian, but a French socialist politician in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A firm anti-militarist, He's perhaps most famous outside of France for his assassination at the outbreak of World War I. Given his prominence and pacifist tendencies, his death leads to a whole lot of what-if questions amongst scholars. But for our purposes, what's relevant here is that Hébert's attempts to tarnish and discredit the monarchy had the opposite effect. In Jaurès's denunciation of Hébert, we're going to hear the exasperation of a socialist leader who experienced firsthand how this trial and Hébert's role in it smeared the revolutionary cause and bolstered conservatism for more than a century. Thus, despite pursuing democratic politics almost a century later, Jaurès's condemnation has a passion as if he personally knew Hébert and was a witness to these unsavoury events. Jaurès holds little back. In order to show peoples and kings that not even feelings of pity could weaken the revolution in the face of royal crime, it was enough to strike Marie Antoinette after striking Louis, the former queen after the former king. To demand the head of the king's sister, Madame Elizabeth, as Hébert did day after day, was nothing but a cruel tactical manoeuvre aimed at embarrassing the government, at setting it at odds with humanity if it surrendered to this call, and with the extremists if it resisted. In order to set an example, guillotining Marie Antoinette was enough. It was certainly pointless to crassly insult her by slandering her, allowing her a kind of vengeance in the court of history. Chumet and Hébert showed themselves to be poor revolutionaries when the former before the Council of the Commune and the latter before the tribunal that judged Marie Antoinette accused her of having depraved her son in order to better rule over him in the event of a regency. Hébert served the revolution poorly when he added that Marie Antoinette and Elizabeth, the mother and the aunt, took the child between them and prematurely brought on his puberty in order to later subject him to their whims when he would be king. Marie Antoinette issued a sublime cry of revolt, and this appeal, which the ennoble Pierre Duchesne caused to burst forth from a tortured heart, has been a recruiting tool for reaction for more than a century. And perhaps Chumet was ill-inspired when he complained at the Council of the Commune that the condemned were allowed a mouthful of brandy before they left prison for the gallows. It seems this gave them courage to defy the revolution through their attitude. Did the revolution need its enemies to be cowards in order for it to be strong? In a few months from this time, one will be tempted to say, if need be, give Hébert an entire flask of alcohol so he'll die in a less cowardly fashion. But no, there will be enough sinister mockers around his tumbril. We can keep our contempt to ourselves. Hardly keeping his contempt to himself, historian Jean Jaurès lived with the consequences of Hébert's showmanship. While the allegations against the Queen did little to impact the trial, it did shape how supporters could elicit sympathy both at home and abroad. In the case of the latter, the foreign response to the Queen's trial will be the focus of the first episode extra for this episode. Truth be told, there was only going to be one episode extra, but while I was down the rabbit hole, I came across some fascinating efforts amongst Austrian officials to intervene and save the Queen through either diplomatic or military efforts. But these met resistance from within their own government. Needless to say, these are two fascinating deep dives surrounding the Queen's final weeks, so make sure not to miss it. And on the topic of final weeks, a quick reminder that I could really use your help. This episode extra and tons of other bonus content is available exclusively to supporters of the show. If you find Grey History entertaining, if you find it educational, if you find that you want more Grey History, both now and in the future, then please support the revolution by keeping it on the air. By donating a cup of coffee to produce new episodes, you can enjoy ad-free listening fantastic bonus content, the community chat room, and a range of other perks. Just follow the links in the show notes and on the website, or Google Grey History Patreon. There's now a 7-day free trial, and you can cancel anytime, so there's no downside to giving the community a try. So please pick up your phone and please support the show today. After 2 days of testimony in which the Queen was accused of every crime imaginable, the prosecution brought its case to an end. At 4 a.m. in the morning, on the 16th of October, the jury gave its verdict: guilty on all charges. Death was the only possible sentence, and the blade came with speed. Returned to her cell, the former Queen had just 8 hours to live. In this time, she secured material to write a letter to Madame Elizabeth, her sister-in-law, and, according to Hébert, her accomplice in the most hideous of crimes. Addressing those allegations directly, she implored Elizabeth to forgive her nephew, claiming that the boy could not be blamed for things he simply didn't understand. But, more importantly, her final words were those of comfort and defiance. It is to you, my sister, that I write for the last time. I have been condemned, not to a shameful death, for that is for criminals, but to rejoin your brother, like him, innocent, and I hope to show the same courage in these last moments. I am calm as one is when conscience has no reproach to make. I bitterly regret abandoning my children. You know that I only lived for them and for you, my good and sweet sister, you who have sacrificed everything to remain with us. In what a position I leave you. With her last letter complete, the sleepless Queen prepared for the end. Changing one final time, the widower's black was replaced with a shabby white gown. Supervised by her watchful guards, officials soon arrived to escort the Queen. Leaving the conciergerie after 11 a.m., Paris had come to watch. Since 5 in the morning, the drums had been beating, and onlookers had secured the best positions for a view. From rumoured escape attempts to morbid curiosity, the city was buzzing with anticipation. Troops were stationed at every bridge, every gate, every square, while the public lined eagerly just to get a fraction of a glimpse. As the Queen's open cart rolled down the uneven streets, there she was, the fabled Austrian Monster. Sitting on a wooden plank, hands bound, and with her freshly cut hair protruding from her cap, the figure struck a fragile but confident pose. More than 20 years prior, a princess had travelled these same streets as the nation's most celebrated guest. Now she was its prisoner, destined for a villain's demise. Clearly emotional at the sight of the Tuileries Palace, the Queen held it together. Her last words were an apology on the scaffold, not to the French people, but to her executioner, having accidentally stepped on his foot. Strapped into position and lowered into place, the machine did its duty with seamless ease. At 12:15 p.m, the widow Capet was dead. For some, it was justice. For others, it was something worse than regicide. Yet one thing can be agreed beyond any doubt. The death of Marie Antoinette was the beginning, not the end. Thousands would share her fate. The Girondins were next. Thank you for listening to episode 81, The Trial of Queen Marie Antoinette. Don't miss the amazing episode extras for this episode, exploring not only reactions across Europe to the Queen's execution, but also last-minute efforts between Austrian officials to save the accused. Next time, it's the Girondins who will be placed on trial. From another purge of the convention to a death in the courtroom itself, the proceedings will be a little different, to say the least. Those members on the True Revolutionary tier can already enjoy early access, and all members can binge the hours of great bonus content accompanying the main show. With ad-free listening and a range of other perks, why not make the most of the new 7-day free trial and join the community today? By donating a coffee or two a month, you can indulge in all the benefits and help ensure that there's more grey history both now and in the future. So please support the show today. Another warm welcome to the newest members of the community, and a special shout out again to the legendary heroes of the Revolution: Brian, Charles, Jeff, Olga, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, Kevin S., and Fernando. Thank you for listening, and all the best in 2025.